When was the last time you woke up at 3 in the morning with your heart pounding, your mind racing through every possible scenario of what could go wrong tomorrow? When did you last feel that crushing weight in your chest, that invisible burden pressing down on your shoulders, making even the simplest decisions feel impossible? If you're listening to this right now, chances are you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been carrying something heavy, something that keeps you awake at night, something that makes your stomach twist with anxiety every time you think about it. Maybe it's that job interview next week that could change everything. Maybe it's the medical test results you're waiting for. Maybe it's your child who's struggling, your marriage that feels like it's hanging by a thread, or those bills stacked on your kitchen table that you can't figure out how to pay. Maybe it's something deeper, something you haven't even been able to put into words yet, but it's there gnawing at you, whispering lies about your future. Here's what I want you to know right now. In this very moment, you didn't stumble across this message by accident. This isn't coincidence. This is God meeting you exactly where you are, in your worry, in your fear, in that place where you feel like you're drowning in uncertainty. And I'm about to share something with you that has the power to completely transform not just how you handle your worries, but how you experience peace in the middle of any storm. You see, for the past 15 years, I've been walking alongside people who are carrying burdens that feel too heavy to bear. I've sat with mothers who can't sleep because their children are making choices that could destroy their lives. I've prayed with fathers who feel like they're failing their families. I've counseled couples on the brink of divorce, business owners facing bankruptcy, and students who feel like their dreams are slipping away. And in every single case, without exception, the breakthrough didn't come when their circumstances changed. It came when they learned how to release their grip on control and place their trust in God's perfect plan. But here's where most people get it wrong. They think trusting God means sitting back passively and hoping for the best. They think surrender means giving up. They think faith is just positive thinking with a religious twist. That's not what we're talking about here. What I'm about to show you is a radical, life-changing approach to worry that goes beyond anything you've probably heard before. This isn't just about feeling better for a few minutes while you're watching this video. This is about rewiring how your brain responds to uncertainty, about developing an unshakable confidence that runs deeper than your circumstances. And I need to warn you about something right up front. What we're going to explore together might challenge everything you think you know about control, about planning, about being responsible. Some I'm going to share might of what I make you uncomfortable, because it goes against every instinct you have to hold tightly to the things that matter most to you. But if you're tired of being held captive by worry, if you're ready to experience the kind of peace that doesn't make logical sense, then you're in exactly the right place. Let me tell you about Sarah. 3 months ago, she was exactly where you might be right now. She'd been promoted to a leadership position at work, which should have been exciting, but instead it terrified her. Every decision she made felt like it could be the wrong one. She was losing sleep, snapping at her family, and spending bed hours lying in night replaying conversations and second-guessing herself. The worry had become so consuming that she couldn't enjoy anything anymore. Even good moments were overshadowed by this constant anxiety about what might go wrong next. Sarah tried everything she could think of. She made lists, she planned obsessively. She researched every possible outcome. She read self-help books about managing anxiety. She tried meditation apps and breathing exercises. Some of these things helped temporarily, but the relief never lasted. The worry always came back, often stronger than before. She felt like she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. Then Sarah discovered something that changed everything. She learned that her worry wasn't actually about her job at all. It wasn't about her competence or her ability to make good decisions. At its core, her worry was about trust. She was trying to carry a responsibility that was never meant to be hers alone. She was attempting to control outcomes that were ultimately in God's hands. And the moment she understood this, everything shifted. Now, I want to be clear about something. Sarah didn't become irresponsible. She didn't stop preparing or planning or working hard, but she stopped carrying the crushing weight of trying to guarantee specific outcomes. She learned how to do her part with excellence while releasing the results to God. And the transformation was remarkable. Not only did her anxiety decrease dramatically, but her performance at work actually improved. Her relationships got stronger. She started sleeping through the night again. She found joy in the present moment, instead of constantly living in fear of the future. This is what's possible when you understand how to truly give your worries to Jesus. But before we go any further, I want to address the elephant in the room. Maybe you're thinking, I've tried to give my worries to God before and it didn't work. I prayed about it. I asked God to take it away, but I still worry just as much as before. If that's you, you're not alone. Most people have had that experience, and there's a reason why it happens. The problem isn't that God doesn't want to take your worries. The problem isn't that you don't have enough faith. The problem is that most of us have never been taught how to actually release our grip on the things we're worried about. We pray and ask God to handle it, but then we immediately pick it back up again. It's like handing someone a heavy suitcase and then continuing to hold onto the handle. You're still carrying the weight even though you've asked for help. What I'm going to show you today is how to completely let go of that handle, how to experience what it feels like to have God truly carry the burden for you, how to walk in the kind of peace that allows you to sleep soundly at night, make decisions with confidence, and find joy even in uncertain circumstances. But first, we need to understand something crucial about worry itself. Worry isn't just an emotion. It's not just a feeling that comes and goes. Worry is actually a form of prayer. It's meditation. When you worry, you're focusing intensely on something. You're imagining it in vivid detail. You're feeling it emotionally, and you're doing it repeatedly. The only difference between worry and traditional prayer is the content and the direction. When you worry about your child's safety, you're essentially praying for something bad to happen. When you worry about losing your job, you're meditating on unemployment and financial struggle. When you worry about your health, you're visualizing sickness and decline. This isn't something you're doing intentionally, but it's what's happening at a spiritual level. Now, I'm not saying that worry causes bad things to happen. That's not biblical, and it's not helpful. What I am saying is that worry is a misuse of one of your most powerful spiritual faculties, your imagination and your ability to focus. The same mental and spiritual energy that you're currently using to worry, connining yourself with God's perfect plan for your life. This is why Jesus didn't just tell us, be redirected toward trust, toward peace, toward not to worry. He gave us specific instructions about what to do instead. In Matthew chapter 6, he tells us to consider the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. He's not just giving us a nice analogy about nature. He's teaching us how to redirect our mental energy toward trust instead of anxiety. Think about this for a moment. Birds don't have retirement accounts. They don't have insurance policies or emergency funds. They don't have backup plans for bad weather or economic downturns. Yet they wake up every morning singing. They're not careless or irresponsible, but they're not consumed with anxiety about their future provision. They trust that their needs will be met, and they focus their energy on doing what they were created to do. Jesus is saying that if God takes care of creatures that live for just a few years, how much more will He take care of you, His beloved child, someone He's planned an eternal future with? But here's the key. The birds receive this provision because they align themselves with God's design for their lives. They don't try to be something they're not. They don't spend their time worrying about things outside their control. They simply trust and obey the instincts God has given them. This is exactly what God wants for you. Not a life of careless passivity, but a life of confident trust. A life where you do your part with excellence while resting in the assurance that God is handling the parts that are beyond your control. A life where you can make decisions based on wisdom and faith rather than fear and anxiety. But how do you actually make this transition? How do you move from chronic worry to confident trust? It starts with understanding the difference between your responsibility and God's responsibility. This is where most people get confused, and it's why their attempts to give it to God don't work. Your responsibility includes things like working diligently, treating people with kindness, making wise choices with the information you have, taking care of your body, nurturing your relationships, and growing in your faith. These are things that are directly under your control, things you can actually influence through your actions and decisions. God's responsibility includes things like the ultimate outcomes of your efforts, other people's choices and responses, timing, circumstances beyond your control, and the bigger picture of how everything fits together in His plan. These are things that you have no direct control over, no matter how much you worry about them. When you try to take responsibility for things that belong to God, you create anxiety in your life. When you neglect the things that are actually your responsibility, you create chaos and missed opportunities. But when you focus your energy on your part while trusting God with His part, You experience peace, effectiveness, and joy. Let me paint a picture for you of what this looks like in real life. Last year, I met a man named David who owned a small construction company. For months, he'd been losing sleep over a major project that was behind schedule and over budget. He was convinced that if this project failed, it would ruin his reputation and destroy his business. Every morning, he'd wake up with his mind immediately racing through worst-case scenarios. What if the client sued him? What if he had to lay off his employees? What if he lost his house? David was carrying the weight of outcomes that were largely outside his control. Weather delays, supply chain issues, unexpected structural problems. These weren't things he could prevent through worry, but he was trying to control them anyway, and it was eating him alive. His wife told me she barely recognized the man she'd married. The health, his relationships, and iron stress was affecting his ability to make good decisions about the project itself. When David learned to separate his responsibilities from God's responsibilities, everything changed. His responsibility was to do excellent work, communicate honestly with his client, make the best decisions he could with available information, and treat his workers fairly. God's responsibility was the ultimate outcome, the client's response, the factors beyond David's control, and how this situation would fit into the bigger picture of his life and business. The moment David made this distinction, he felt like 100-pound weight had been lifted from his chest. He didn't become careless or stop working hard. In fact, he started working more effectively because he wasn't paralyzed by anxiety. He slept better, his relationship with his wife improved, and he was able to think creatively about solutions instead of being consumed by fear. Here's what's fascinating. The project ended up being more successful than David had originally hoped, not because he worried less, but because he was able to function at his best when he wasn't carrying burdens that were never meant to be his. The client was impressed with how David handled the challenges, and it led to more business opportunities. But here's the crucial point. David had already found peace before he knew how the project would turn out. His peace wasn't dependent on the outcome. It was dependent on his trust in God's plan. This is what Jesus meant when he said his yoke is easy and his burden is light. He's not saying that life will be without challenges. He's saying that when you're aligned with God's plan and trusting in his sovereignty, you don't have to carry the crushing weight of trying to control everything. You can rest in the assurance that God is working all things together for your good. But let me address something that might be going through your mind right now. You might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but you don't understand my situation. My problems are real. My concerns are legitimate. I can't just ignore them and hope everything works out. And you're absolutely right. Your concerns are real, and ignoring them isn't the answer. What we're talking about isn't denial or wishful thinking. It's a radical reorientation of how you approach uncertainty. It's learning to acknowledge your concerns while refusing to let them dominate your thoughts and emotions. It's the difference between being aware of potential challenges and being controlled by fear of them. Think about it this way. A skilled pilot doesn't ignore turbulence when it happens. They acknowledge it. They take appropriate action, they communicate with air traffic control, and they make necessary adjustments. But they don't panic. They don't abandon their training. They don't let fear override their judgment. They trust their instruments, follow their procedures, and have confidence in their ability to navigate through the difficult conditions. This is exactly how God wants you to handle the turbulence in your life. Acknowledge the challenges, take appropriate action, seek wise counsel, and make necessary adjustments. But don't panic. Don't abandon your faith. Don't let fear override your trust in God's goodness and sovereignty. Trust the promises in His Word, follow His principles, and have confidence that He's navigating you through whatever storm you're facing. The key is learning to distinguish between productive concern and destructive worry. Productive concern motivates you to take appropriate action. It helps you prepare, plan, and respond wisely to challenges. Destructive worry, on the other hand, paralyzes you with fear, consumes your mental energy, and prevents you from functioning effectively. Here's a simple test you can use. If thinking about a situation leads you to take helpful action or make positive changes, that's productive concern. If thinking about a situation just makes you more anxious without leading to any constructive steps, that's destructive worry. Productive concern has an endpoint. Once you've done what you can do, you can let it go. Destructive worry is endless. It keeps circling back even after you've done everything possible. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was facing the most difficult situation imaginable: betrayal, torture, and death. He acknowledged the reality of what was coming. He even asked God if there was another way. But ultimately, he surrendered to God's plan with the words, "Not my will, but yours be done." He felt the full weight of what he was facing, but he didn't let anxiety control his actions or his trust in the Father. This is the model for how we can handle our own difficult situations. Feel the emotions, acknowledge the challenges, ask for God's help, but ultimately surrender to His will and trust in His plan. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop working toward solutions. It means you do your part while resting in the assurance that God is doing His part. Now let me share with you a practical framework that can help you make this transition from worry to trust. I call it the release method, and it's based on biblical principles that have helped thousands of people find freedom from chronic anxiety. The R stands for recognize. The first step is learning to recognize when you're starting to worry. Most of us are so accustomed to anxiety that we don't even notice when it begins. We just accept it as normal background noise in our minds. But worry is like a fire. It's much easier to put out when it's small than when it's consumed your entire mental landscape. Start paying attention to the physical sensations in your body. Where do you feel tension? How does your breathing change? What happens to your posture? Notice the thoughts that tend to trigger anxiety. Are there certain topics, situations, or times of day when worry is most likely to surface? The goal isn't to judge yourself for worrying, but simply to become aware of when it's happening. The E stands for examine. Once you've recognized that you're worrying, the next step is to examine what's actually happening. Ask yourself, what specifically am I worried about? Is this something I can control or influence? What action, if any, should I take right now? Am I imagining worst-case scenarios or dealing with actual facts? This examination process helps you separate legitimate concerns that require action from anxious thoughts that are just spinning in your mind without purpose. It helps you distinguish between what's your responsibility and what belongs to God. The L stands for let go. This is where the real transformation happens. Once you've identified what's actually your responsibility versus what belongs to God, you consciously choose to release your grip on the things outside your control. This isn't a one-time decision. It's something you might need to do multiple times throughout the day. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to control outcomes that aren't yours to control. It means you trust that God's plan is better than your plan, even when you can't see how everything will work out. The E stands for engage. Instead of letting your mind continue to circle around anxious thoughts, you intentionally engage with something constructive. This might mean taking action on something that is within your control, focusing on the present moment, or redirecting your mental energy toward gratitude, prayer, or meaningful activity. The A stands for affirm. You remind yourself of God's character, His promises, and His track record in your life. You speak truth over the lies that anxiety tries to tell you. You declare your trust in His plan, even when you can't see the whole picture. The S stands for surrender. This is the ongoing posture of releasing control to God. It's not just something you do once, but a way of living that acknowledges God's sovereignty in every area of your life. And the final E stands for expect. You choose to expect good things from God, not because you're guaranteed that life will be easy, but because you know that God is good and that He's working everything together for your ultimate benefit. This might sound like a lot of steps, but with practice, this process becomes almost automatic. Instead of spending hours consumed by worry, you learn to quickly identify what's happening, take appropriate action, and release the rest to God. Let me tell you about a woman named Maria who discovered this truth in the most unexpected way. 6 months ago, Maria received news that no mother ever wants to hear. Her 19-year-old son had been arrested on drug charges, not just possession, but distribution. The phone call came at 2 in the morning, and in that instant, Maria felt like her world had completely collapsed. For weeks afterward, Maria couldn't function. She'd lie awake replaying every conversation she'd ever had with her son, wondering where she went wrong. She'd spend hours researching lawyers, calling treatment centers, and trying to orchestrate his defense strategy. She stopped eating regularly, stopped exercising, stopped connecting with friends. Her entire existence revolved around trying to fix her son's situation. The irony is, that all of Maria's frantic activity wasn't actually helping her son. In fact, it was making things worse. Her anxiety was so palpable that every conversation with him became tense and overwhelming. Her desperate attempts to control his legal proceedings were interfering with his attorney's strategy. Her sleepless nights and constant stress were affecting her ability to think clearly and make wise decisions. Then something remarkable happened. Maria's pastor introduced her to the release method, and she decided to try it, not because she had faith it would work, but because she was so exhausted that she had nothing left to lose. The first time she went through the process, she could barely get through it. Every instinct screamed against letting go of control over her son's future, but gradually, something began to shift. Maria started to see that her responsibility was to love her son unconditionally, support him emotionally, help him find good legal representation, and pray for him consistently. God's responsibility was her son's heart, his choices, the legal outcome, and how this crisis would ultimately shape both their lives. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. As Maria learned to release her grip on outcomes she couldn't control, she found herself able to be the mother her son actually needed. Instead of anxious phone calls filled with questions and advice, she began having conversations where she simply listened and offered love. Instead of researching every possible legal strategy, she trusted his attorney to do their job while she focused on being emotionally present. Here's what amazed everyone who knew Maria. As she became less anxious about her son's situation, he began opening up to her in ways he hadn't done in years. The space she created by releasing control actually drew them closer together, and while his legal situation was still serious, Maria found that she could navigate it with wisdom and peace instead of panic and desperation. The outcome? Her son entered a treatment program as part of his plea agreement. He's now been sober for 4 months and has started rebuilding his life. But here's the crucial point. Maria had already found peace before any of those positive changes happened. Her peace wasn't dependent on her son making better choices. It was dependent on her trust that God was at work in both their lives, even in the middle of the crisis. This is what happens when you truly understand how to give your worries to Jesus. You don't become indifferent to outcomes, but you stop being controlled by your need to guarantee specific results. You don't stop caring about the people and situations that matter to you, but you stop carrying the crushing weight of trying to manage things that are outside your influence. Now I want to address something that might be creating resistance in your mind right now. You might be thinking, but if I stop worrying, won't I become lazy? Won't I stop being motivated to work hard or prepare for challenges? This is one of the most common misconceptions about releasing worry to God. The truth is exactly the opposite. When you're not consumed by anxiety, you actually become more effective, not less. Worry clouds your judgment, paralyzes your decision-making, and wastes enormous amounts of mental energy that could be directed toward productive action. When you release that anxiety, you free up your mind to think creatively, make wise decisions, and take focused action. Think about the best performance you've ever had in any area of your life. Maybe it was an important presentation at work, a crucial conversation in a relationship, or a challenging physical task. I guarantee that in those moments of peak performance, you weren't consumed by worry about the outcome. You were focused, present, and trusting in your preparation and abilities. This is what God wants for every area of your life. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the presence of peace and confidence in the middle of uncertainty. Not the guarantee that everything will go exactly as you hope, but the assurance that God is sovereign over every situation and that His plans for you are good. But let me be honest with you about something. Learning to live this way isn't just a matter of understanding these concepts intellectually. It requires practice, patience, and often a fundamental shift in how you view your relationship with God and your role in the world. Most of us have been conditioned from childhood to believe that we're responsible for controlling outcomes, that good things happen to people who worry enough and plan enough and work hard enough. While hard work and planning are important, the idea that we can guarantee specific results through our efforts alone is an illusion that creates enormous stress and anxiety. The reality is that we live in a world where countless variables affect every situation. Other people's choices, economic conditions, weather patterns, technological changes, health issues, timing factors that we can't predict or control, all of these things influence the outcomes we care about. When we try to carry the weight of controlling all these variables, we set ourselves up for chronic anxiety and eventual burnout. God never intended for you to carry that kind of responsibility. He designed you to be a co-laborer with Him, not the sole architect of your destiny. Your job is to do your part with excellence and integrity. His job is to coordinate all the factors you can't see or control to bring about outcomes that serve His purposes and your ultimate good. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop planning for the future. It means you plan and prepare while holding your plans lightly, ready to adjust as God opens and closes doors. It means you work diligently while trusting that your security comes from your relationship with Him, not from your ability to control circumstances. Let me share a personal example that illustrates this principle. Several years ago, I was offered what seemed like the perfect job opportunity. It was everything I thought I wanted: better pay, more prestige, work that aligned with my interests and skills. I spent weeks analyzing every aspect of the decision, trying to predict how it would affect every area of my life. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. What if I wasn't successful in the new role? What if the company culture wasn't what it seemed? What if leaving my current position turned out to be a mistake? I was losing sleep, second-guessing myself constantly, and making everyone around me miserable with my endless analysis of pros and cons. Finally, my wife asked me a simple question that changed everything. Have you actually asked God what He wants you to do? I realized that in all my careful planning and worrying, I had never actually sought God's direction. I had been trying to figure out the right answer through my own analysis instead of trusting Him to guide me. That night I spent time in prayer, not asking God to bless my decision, but asking Him to show me His will. I committed to following His leading, even if it didn't make sense from a practical standpoint. The peace that came over me was immediate and profound, not because I suddenly knew what to do, but because I had released the burden of making the perfect choice. Over the next few days, several things happened that made God's direction clear. A conversation with a mentor raised concerns I hadn't considered. A friend shared insights about the company that I wouldn't have discovered through research. Most importantly, I had a growing sense in my spirit that this opportunity, while good, wasn't what God had planned for me at that time. I turned down the job offer. 6 months later, an even better opportunity came along, one that I never could have anticipated and wouldn't have been available if I had taken the first job. But here's the key point. I had found peace before I knew how things would work out. The peace came from trusting God's plan, not from getting the outcome I originally wanted. This is how God wants you to live every day, not constantly anxious about making perfect decisions, but trusting that He will guide you as you seek His will and remain open to His leading. Not paralyzed by fear of making mistakes, but confident that even your mistakes can be redeemed and used for good in God's plan. The Bible tells us in Romans 8:28 that God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Notice it doesn't say that all things are good. Some things are difficult, painful, or disappointing. But it promises that God can take every circumstance, even the challenging ones, and weave them into a pattern that ultimately serves your good and His glory. This promise transforms how you can view every situation that's causing you worry right now. That job situation you're stressed about, God can use it for good regardless of how it turns out. That relationship conflict that's keeping you awake at night, God can bring growth and healing through it. That financial pressure that feels overwhelming, God can provide in ways you haven't even imagined yet. But accessing this peace requires something that goes against every natural instinct. You have to stop trying to write the script for your life and trust that God's script is better than anything you could create. Most of us approach life like we're directing a movie. We have an idea of how we want each scene to play out, and we get anxious when reality doesn't match our vision. We try to control other people's lines, manipulate circumstances to fit our plot, and force outcomes that we think will make us happy. God invites you to a completely different way of living. Instead of being the director of your life, you can be the lead actor in a story that God is writing. Your job isn't to control the plot or guarantee specific outcomes. Your job is to play your role with excellence, trust the director's vision, and be present in each scene as it unfolds. This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of being frustrated when circumstances don't match your expectations, you become curious about what God might be doing through the unexpected turns. Instead of being anxious about the future, you become excited about the story he's unfolding. Instead of being overwhelmed by the weight of controlling outcomes, you become free to focus on playing your part well. Think about the actors in your favorite movies. The ones who give the best performances aren't the ones trying to direct the film from their position in front of the camera. They're the ones who trust the director's vision, immerse themselves fully in their character, and respond authentically to whatever happens in each scene. This is exactly what God is inviting you to do with your life. Trust His direction, immerse yourself fully in the role He's given you, and respond with faith to whatever unfolds. When you live this way, you discover that God's script for your life is far more interesting, meaningful, and ultimately satisfying than anything you could have written for yourself. But I want to be completely honest about what this journey looks like. Learning to release control and trust God's plan isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process that requires patience with yourself and commitment to practicing new patterns of thinking and responding. There will be days when you feel like you've mastered this principle, when peace comes easily and trust feels natural. There will also be days when anxiety creeps back in, when your old patterns of worry and control feel overwhelming. This is normal and expected. Growth in any area of life happens gradually, with setbacks and breakthroughs along the way. The key is to be gentle with yourself during this process while remaining committed to the journey. Each time you notice yourself falling back into worry, see it as an opportunity to practice the release method again. Each time you successfully surrender a concern to God, celebrate that victory and let it build your confidence for the next challenge. Remember that God isn't looking for perfect trust from you. He's looking for willing trust. He isn't waiting for you to never feel anxious again before He starts working in your life. He's working in your life right now, using even your struggles with worry as part of your growth and transformation. Consider the story of a man named Robert, who discovered this truth during the most challenging period of his career. Robert was a software engineer who had spent 5 years building what he believed was a revolutionary app. He'd invested his savings, worked 18-hour days, and sacrificed time with his family because he was convinced this product would secure their financial future forever. Then, just weeks before launch, a major tech company released something remarkably similar. Not identical, but close enough that Robert's app suddenly seemed obsolete before it even reached the market. The investors pulled out. The team disbanded. 5 years of work seemed to vanish overnight. Robert's initial response was exactly what you'd expect. He became consumed with rage, then depression, then frantic attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. He spent months analyzing what went wrong, blaming himself for not moving faster, not being smarter, not anticipating the competition. The worry ate away at him like acid. How would he provide for his family? How could he face the people who had believed in him? What if this failure defined the rest of his career? But here's where Robert's story takes an unexpected turn. During one of his darkest nights, when sleep seemed impossible and his mind wouldn't stop racing through worst-case scenarios, he remembered something his grandfather had told him years earlier. His grandfather, a farmer who had weathered droughts, floods, and market crashes, had said, "Son, the ground doesn't belong to you. The weather doesn't answer to you. Your job is to plant good seeds and tend them well. God's job is the harvest." At the time, Robert had dismissed this as old-fashioned thinking, but lying there at 3 in the morning, drowning in anxiety about his failed venture, those words suddenly made perfect sense. Robert realized he had been carrying the weight of outcomes that were never his to control. Market timing, competitor decisions, investor psychology, consumer preferences, these were all factors completely outside his influence. That night, for the first time in months, Robert experienced what Jesus meant when He said His yoke is easy and His burden is light. Not because his circumstances changed, but because he finally understood what was actually his to carry and what belonged to God. Robert's responsibility had been to create excellent code, solve real problems for users, treat his team with respect, and work with integrity. He had done all of those things well. The market response, the timing, the competitive landscape, the investor decisions, those were variables in a much larger equation that only God could see completely. This realization didn't happen all at once. Over the following weeks, Robert had to repeatedly practice releasing his grip on the outcomes he couldn't control. Every time his mind started spiraling into regret about the past or anxiety about the future, he would consciously redirect his focus to what was actually within his influence right now. something remarkable began to happen. As Robert stopped carrying the crushing weight of trying to guarantee specific results, his creativity returned, his relationships improved, his ability to see opportunities increased dramatically. Within 6 months, he had identified a completely different problem that his technical skills could solve. This time, instead of trying to control every variable, he focused on doing excellent work while trusting God with the results. The new venture succeeded beyond anything Robert had originally imagined. But here's the crucial insight. His peace and confidence weren't dependent on this success. He had already learned to find security in his relationship with God, rather than in his ability to control outcomes. The success was wonderful, but it wasn't necessary for his well-being. This is the freedom that Jesus offers to everyone who follows him. Not the promise that everything will always go according to your plans, but the assurance that God's plans are always better than yours, even when you can't see how. Now let's address something that might be creating confusion in your mind. You might be wondering, how do I know the difference between wise planning and anxious control? How do I prepare responsibly without crossing the line into worry? These are excellent questions, and the distinction is crucial. Wise planning focuses on preparation and stewardship. It asks questions like, what skills should I develop? How can I be a good steward of my resources? What steps can I take to be prepared for likely scenarios? Wise planning is action-oriented, time-limited, and leads to concrete steps that improve your situation. Anxious control, on the other hand, focuses on guaranteeing outcomes. It asks questions like, how can I make sure this works out exactly as I want? What if this specific thing goes wrong? How can I prevent every possible negative scenario? Anxious control is emotion-driven, endless, and leads to mental spinning that doesn't improve your actual situation. Here's a practical example. Let's say you're concerned about your job security. Wise planning might involve updating your resume, developing new skills, building professional relationships, and maintaining an emergency fund. These are concrete actions that genuinely improve your situation, regardless of what happens with your current job. Anxious control, however, would involve constantly worrying about whether layoffs are coming, obsessively monitoring company news for signs of trouble, losing sleep over rumors and possibilities, and creating elaborate backup plans for scenarios that may never happen. This kind of thinking consumes enormous mental energy without actually improving your position. The key difference is that wise planning empowers you to respond well to whatever happens, while anxious control exhausts you trying to prevent specific outcomes that may be outside your influence entirely. Jesus illustrated this principle beautifully in the parable of the talents. The master didn't give his servants detailed instructions about exactly how to invest his money or guarantee specific returns. He gave them resources and expected them to use wisdom and diligence in managing them. The servants who succeeded were the ones who took appropriate action without being paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. The servant who buried his talent in the ground represents the opposite approach, letting fear of negative outcomes prevent any positive action at all. This is actually another form of trying to control results, just through avoidance rather than manipulation. God's design for your life involves neither anxious control nor fearful avoidance. He wants you to take wise action based on the information and resources He's given you, while trusting Him with variables that are outside your direct influence. This brings us to another crucial aspect of releasing worry, understanding the role of faith in practical decision-making. Faith isn't the absence of planning or the denial of real challenges. Faith is confidence in God's character and promises that enables you to act wisely even in uncertain situations. Consider the example of Noah building the ark. This wasn't a man who ignored practical considerations or acted without planning. The ark required precise measurements, specific materials, careful construction, and detailed preparation for housing thousands of animals. Noah had to use wisdom, skill, and enormous effort over many years. But Noah's peace and motivation didn't come from his ability to guarantee the success of his project. He had never seen rain like God was describing. He had no meteorological data to confirm the forecast. He couldn't control whether the animals would actually come or whether the ark would hold together under the conditions God predicted. Noah's confidence came from trusting God's character and promises. He did his part with excellence while leaving the outcomes in God's hands. The result was not just physical salvation for his family, but a profound peace that enabled him to work steadily for decades on a project that must have seemed impossible to everyone around him. This is the model for how you can approach every challenge in your life. Do your part with excellence. Use the wisdom and resources God has given you, but derive your peace and security from His promises rather than from your ability to control results. Let me share another story that illustrates this principle in a modern context. Jennifer was a single mother facing one of the most difficult decisions of her life. Her ex-husband had taken a job in another state and wanted to relocate their 8-year-old daughter to live with him. Legally, he had the right to make this request. Practically, it would mean Jennifer would see her daughter only during school breaks and summer vacations. Jennifer's initial response was panic. She couldn't imagine life without daily contact with her daughter. She began researching legal strategies to prevent the move, considering relocating herself to the same city, and even contemplating more drastic measures to keep her daughter close. The anxiety was consuming her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate at work, and found herself snapping at her daughter during the precious time they had together. The irony was that her desperate attempts to hold on to her daughter were actually damaging the relationship she was trying to protect. Then Jennifer's pastor helped her see the situation through the lens of trusting God's plan. Her responsibility was to love her daughter unconditionally, maintain their relationship regardless of distance, provide stability and wisdom during a difficult transition, and make decisions based on her daughter's best interests rather than her own fears. God's responsibility was her daughter's heart, her ex-husband's motivations, the long-term effects of whatever decision was made, and how this challenge would shape both Jennifer and her daughter's character and faith. This shift in perspective changed everything. Instead of fighting a battle she couldn't win, Jennifer focused on what she could actually influence. She had honest conversations with her daughter about the upcoming changes. She researched ways to maintain close relationships across distance. She worked on improving her co-parenting relationship with her ex-husband. Most importantly, she began praying for her daughter's well-being and happiness, rather than for specific outcomes that would minimize her own pain. The result was unexpected. As Jennifer released her desperate grip on controlling the situation, her ex-husband began noticing the positive changes in her attitude and their communication. He started asking for her input on decisions about their daughter's care. Eventually, he proposed a modified arrangement that would allow their daughter to spend more time with Jennifer than originally planned. But here's the key insight. Jennifer had already found peace before this compromise was offered. Her well-being was no longer dependent on specific custody arrangements because she had learned to trust that God was orchestrating a plan that would ultimately serve everyone's best interests. The situation wasn't perfect. Jennifer still missed her daughter during the weeks she was away. But instead of being consumed by bitterness and anxiety, she found ways to use that time for personal growth, service to others, and deepening her relationship with God. When her daughter was with her, their time together was rich and meaningful, rather than overshadowed by constant worry about the next separation. This is what becomes possible when you truly understand how to release your worries to Jesus. You don't stop caring about the people and situations that matter to you, but you stop being controlled by the need to manipulate outcomes according to your preferences. Now, I want to address something that might be happening in your heart right now. As you listen to these stories and principles, you might be feeling a mixture of hope and resistance. Part of you recognizes the peace and freedom that comes from trusting God's plan, but another part of you is afraid to let go of the illusion of control. This internal conflict is completely normal and actually indicates that God's Spirit is working in your life. The resistance you feel isn't a sign that this approach won't work for you. It's a sign that you're being invited to a deeper level of trust than you've experienced before. Think about learning to swim. The natural instinct when you're in deep water is to flail around trying to control your position through frantic effort. But experienced swimmers know that the key to staying afloat is actually relaxation and trust in the water's ability to support you. The more you fight against the water, the more likely you are to sink. The more you relax and work with the water's properties, the more effortlessly you can move through it. Worry is like flailing in deep water. It feels like you're doing something productive, but it actually makes your situation more difficult and exhausting. Trusting God's plan is like learning to relax and float. It feels counterintuitive at first, but it's actually the most efficient and peaceful way to navigate life's challenges. The transition from worry to trust doesn't happen through willpower alone. It happens through gradually experiencing God's faithfulness in smaller situations, which builds your confidence to trust Him with bigger challenges. Start by identifying one worry that's been consuming your mental energy, preferably something significant enough to matter, but not so overwhelming that it feels impossible to release. Practice the release method with this specific concern for the next week. Notice how it feels to consciously hand this burden over to God multiple times each day. Pay attention to what happens in your body when you make this choice. Notice the physical sensation of releasing tension. Observe how your thinking becomes clearer when you're not carrying the weight of trying to control outcomes. Watch for evidence of God's faithfulness as you learn to trust Him with this particular area. As you experience the peace and effectiveness that comes from releasing control in one area, you'll naturally become more willing to apply the same principle to other worries. Trust builds on itself. Each experience of God's faithfulness makes it easier to believe He can be trusted with the next challenge. Remember, God isn't asking you to trust Him because He needs your confidence to accomplish His purposes. He's inviting you to trust Him because He knows that worry is destroying your peace, your relationships, and your ability to experience the abundant life He has planned for you. Every moment you spend consumed by anxiety about outcomes you can't control is a moment you're not available to experience the joy, love, and purpose that God wants to give you right now, in this present moment, regardless of how uncertain the future might seem. This is why Jesus said in Matthew 6:34, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." He wasn't minimizing the reality of future challenges or telling you to be irresponsible about planning. He was pointing you toward a fundamental truth about how human beings are designed to function. Your mind and emotions were created to handle one day at a time. When you try to carry the emotional weight of next week's problems, next month's uncertainties, and next year's possibilities all at once, you overload your mental and emotional systems. It's like trying to carry 100 pounds when you're only designed to carry 20. Eventually, something breaks down. But when you focus your emotional energy on today's actual responsibilities, while trusting God with tomorrow's unknowns, you operate within your design specifications. You think more clearly, make better decisions, and have energy available for the relationships and opportunities right in front of you. Let me tell you about a conversation I had last month with a woman named Patricia. She'd been a faithful member of our church for over a decade, but recently she'd stopped coming to services. When I reached out to her, she explained that she felt like a hypocrite sitting in church while her mind was constantly racing with worry about her elderly mother's declining health. "Pastor," she said, "I know I'm supposed to have faith, but I can't stop thinking about what's going to happen when Mom can't live alone anymore. What if she falls and I'm not there? What if her dementia gets worse? What if I have to put her in a nursing home and she thinks I'm abandoning her? What if I can't afford the care she needs?" I pray about it, but the worry just comes right back. Patricia was experiencing something that many believers struggle with, the gap between knowing what God's word says about worry and actually experiencing the peace that word promises. She'd been taught that Christians shouldn't worry, so she felt guilty about her anxiety on top of feeling overwhelmed by her circumstances. Here's what I shared with Patricia, and what I want to share with you. God doesn't condemn you for feeling worried. He invites you to bring those worries to Him so He can replace them with His peace. The problem isn't that you have concerns about real situations. The problem is trying to carry the weight of those concerns alone. Patricia and I worked through a simple but powerful exercise. We made 2 lists. On the first list, we wrote down everything she was worried about regarding her mother's care. The list was long. Medical emergencies, financial costs, care decisions, her mother's emotional well-being, the impact on Patricia's own family, and many other concerns. Then we made a second list. This one contained only the things Patricia could actually control or directly influence today. This list was much shorter. Spending quality time with her mother, researching care options, having honest conversations about her mother's wishes, maintaining her own health so she could be a good caregiver, and seeking wisdom from others who had navigated similar situations. The difference between these 2 lists was striking. The first list, all her worries, was mostly about future scenarios and other people's responses. The second list, her actual responsibilities, was entirely about present actions she could take with the resources and information available to her right now. "Patricia," I said, What if you focused all your mental and emotional energy on list number 2, and every time your mind started spiraling through list number 1, you consciously handed those concerns back to God? The transformation didn't happen immediately, but it was profound. Instead of lying awake at night imagining worst-case scenarios, Patricia began using that time to pray specifically for her mother's peace and comfort. Instead of researching every possible care option obsessively, she set aside 2 hours each week to gather information and make calls, then deliberately stopped thinking about it until the next scheduled time. Most importantly, instead of being anxious and distracted during her visits with her mother, Patricia became fully present. She listened to her mother's stories, laughed at her jokes, and created beautiful memories during a season that could have been consumed entirely by worry about what was coming next. Here's what amazed Patricia. As she stopped trying to control every aspect of her mother's future care, she became much more effective at providing good care in the present. Her mother began opening up about her own fears and preferences. Family members started offering help they hadn't provided before. Resources and opportunities appeared that Patricia never could have orchestrated through worry and planning. But the most significant change was in Patricia herself. She told me, "For the first time in months, I can actually enjoy my mother's company instead of being consumed by dread about losing her. I realized that my worry was stealing the precious time we have together right now." This is one of the most tragic aspects of chronic worry. It robs you of the very experiences and relationships you're trying to protect. When you're constantly anxious about losing something, you can't fully appreciate having it. When you're perpetually worried about future challenges, you miss the beauty and opportunities available in the present moment. Jesus understood this perfectly. That's why he didn't just tell us not to worry. He gave us a specific alternative. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. The antidote to worry isn't positive thinking or denial. It's purposeful focus on God's priorities and promises. When you seek God's kingdom first, you align your perspective with eternal realities rather than temporary circumstances. You remember that your ultimate security comes from your relationship with Him, not from your ability to control your environment. You focus on character development, service to others, and spiritual growth, things that have lasting value regardless of how your immediate circumstances unfold. When you seek God's righteousness first, you prioritize doing what's right over getting what you want. You make decisions based on biblical principles rather than fear-based calculations. You trust that obedience to God's ways will lead to outcomes that serve your true best interests, even when those outcomes look different from what you originally hoped for. This doesn't mean you become passive about practical concerns. Seeking God's kingdom includes being a good steward of the resources and responsibilities He's given you, but it means you derive your peace and security from your relationship with Him rather than from your circumstances. Let me paint a picture for you of what this looks like in everyday life. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning with a completely different relationship to uncertainty. Instead of your first thoughts being anxious reviews of everything that could go wrong today, you begin with gratitude for another opportunity to walk with God through whatever unfolds. Instead of checking your phone immediately to see if any new problems have emerged overnight, you spend a few minutes acknowledging God's presence and asking for His guidance for the day ahead. You review your actual responsibilities and commit to handling them with excellence, but you release your grip on controlling how other people respond or how circumstances develop. Throughout the day, when you notice your mind starting to spiral into worry about future scenarios, you have a practiced response. You pause, take a deep breath, and consciously hand that concern back to God. You redirect your attention to whatever task or person is right in front of you. You choose presence over anxiety, action over rumination, trust over control. When challenges arise, and they will, you respond with wisdom and appropriate action, but you don't carry the emotional weight of guaranteeing specific outcomes. You do your part and trust God with His part. You make decisions based on the information available to you right now, without trying to predict and prepare for every possible future scenario. In conversations with family and friends, you're fully present, instead of being distracted by mental rehearsals of problems that haven't happened yet. You listen more deeply, love more freely, and contribute more meaningfully because your emotional energy isn't being drained by constant anxiety. At night, instead of lying awake replaying the day's events and previewing tomorrow's concerns, you can actually rest. You review the day with gratitude for God's faithfulness, acknowledge any mistakes without being consumed by regret, and trust Him with whatever tomorrow brings. This isn't fantasy. This is the abundant life that Jesus promised to everyone who follows Him. It's not a life without challenges, but it's a life where challenges don't define your emotional state or steal your peace. It's not a life where everything goes according to your plans, but it's a life where you can trust that God's plans are always better than your plans. The question is, what's preventing you from experiencing this kind of life right now? What would you need to release to God in order to walk in this level of peace and trust? For many people, the biggest obstacle isn't doubt about God's ability to handle their concerns. It's fear that if they stop worrying, somehow they'll become less caring or less responsible. There's a subtle belief that worry is a form of love, that anxious people are more caring people. This is one of the most destructive lies that keeps people trapped in cycles of anxiety. Worry is not love. Worry is actually the opposite of love in many ways. Love seeks the best for others and trusts in good outcomes. Worry imagines the worst for others and expects negative outcomes. Love is patient and hopeful. Worry is impatient and fearful. Think about the people in your life who love you most deeply. Do they express that love through constant anxiety about your well-being? Or do they express it through encouragement, support, and confidence in your ability to handle challenges? Do you feel more loved when someone worries about you obsessively, or when someone believes in you and trusts God's plan for your life? The truth is that you can actually love others more effectively when you're not consumed by worry about them. When you trust God with their well-being, you're free to offer them presence, wisdom, and support instead of anxiety, control, and fear-based advice. Consider the example of Mary, the mother of Jesus. When she learned that her son was going to face suffering and death, she didn't respond with frantic attempts to protect him or change his circumstances. She didn't spend sleepless nights worrying about his safety or trying to convince him to choose a different path. Instead, Mary pondered these things in her heart and trusted God's plan even when it involved tremendous personal cost. Her love for Jesus was expressed through surrender to God's will, not through worry about outcomes she couldn't control. This surrender didn't make her less caring. It made her love more pure and powerful. This is the kind of love that God wants to develop in you. Love that trusts instead of controlling. Love that supports instead of anxiously hovering. Love that believes the best instead of imagining the worst. This kind of love is only possible when you've learned to release your grip on outcomes and trust God's sovereignty in every situation. But let me address something that might be creating internal resistance as you consider making this shift. You might be thinking, this sounds wonderful in theory, but what if I release control and something terrible happens? What if my worst fears actually come true? Won't I regret not doing everything possible to prevent negative outcomes? This fear of regret is one of the most powerful forces that keeps people trapped in cycles of worry and control. But here's something crucial to understand. You will never be able to prevent every possible negative outcome, no matter how much you worry or how hard you try to control circumstances. Life in a fallen world includes loss, disappointment, and suffering. These experiences are not necessarily the result of insufficient worry or inadequate control. They are part of the human condition that we all navigate together. The question isn't whether you'll face challenges. The question is how you'll face them. You can face difficulties with the peace that comes from trusting God's sovereignty and goodness, or you can face them with the additional burden of regret about things you couldn't have controlled anyway. You can walk through hard seasons with the support of a faith community and the comfort of God's presence, or you can walk through them alone, carrying the weight of believing that everything depends on you. Consider two different people facing the same difficult situation, perhaps a serious illness in their family. Person A has spent months consumed with worry, researching every possible treatment option, second-guessing medical decisions, and trying to control every variable in their loved one's care. Person B has also researched treatment options and sought good medical care, but has focused primarily on providing love, support, and presence, while trusting God with the outcome. If the illness progresses despite everyone's best efforts, Person A will carry not only the grief of their loss, but also the crushing weight of wondering whether they could have done something different, whether they worried enough, whether they tried hard enough. Person B will certainly grieve, but their grief won't be complicated by regret about things that were never within their control. More importantly, Person B will have created beautiful memories during their loved one's illness, memories of presence, peace, and meaningful connection. Person A's memories of the same period will be overshadowed by anxiety, conflict, and the exhausting effort to control an uncontrollable situation. This is why Jesus invites you to a different way of living, not because it guarantees that nothing difficult will ever happen, but because it allows you to experience life fully, even in the midst of uncertainty and challenge. It allows you to love deeply without being paralyzed by fear of loss. It allows you to hope confidently without being crushed by disappointment. The peace that comes from trusting God's plan isn't dependent on circumstances going your way. It's dependent on knowing that God is good, that He loves you deeply, and that He is working in every situation for purposes that serve your ultimate well-being. This kind of peace can coexist with sadness, uncertainty, and even loss, because it's rooted in eternal realities rather than temporary circumstances. Now let me share with you a practical strategy for making this transition from worry to trust. It's something I call the 24-hour rule, and it's helped hundreds of people break free from chronic anxiety patterns. Here's how it works. When you notice yourself beginning to worry about something, ask yourself one simple question. Is there anything I can do about this concern in the next 24 hours? If the answer is yes, take that action and then release the outcome. If the answer is no, consciously hand the concern over to God and redirect your attention to something that is within your current influence. This rule helps you distinguish between productive concern that leads to helpful action and destructive worry that just consumes mental energy without improving your situation. It also helps you stay present-focused rather than getting lost in future scenarios that may never happen. For example, if you're worried about your job security, ask yourself what you can actually do in the next 24 hours. Maybe you can update your resume, reach out to a professional contact, or have a conversation with your supervisor about your performance. Take those actions, then release your grip on outcomes you can't control, like company decisions, economic conditions, or other people's choices. If you're worried about your child's safety while they're away from home, ask yourself what you can do in the next 24 hours. Maybe you can have a conversation about safety guidelines, ensure they have emergency contacts, or pray for their protection. Do those things, then release your need to control circumstances that are outside your direct influence. This approach allows you to be responsible without being consumed by responsibility for things that aren't actually yours to control. It helps you take appropriate action without falling into the trap of believing that your worry is somehow protecting the people and situations you care about. The 24-hour rule also helps you recognize how much mental energy you've been wasting on concerns that don't require any immediate action. When you realize that 90% of your worries fall into the "nothing I can do about this right now" category, you begin to see how much of your emotional life has been consumed by unproductive anxiety. As you practice this rule consistently, something remarkable happens. You begin to trust your ability to handle challenges as they actually arise, rather than exhausting yourself trying to prepare for every possible scenario in advance. You discover that you're more resourceful, creative, and resilient than you realized when you're not carrying the weight of trying to control outcomes. You also begin to notice God's faithfulness in ways you missed when you were consumed by worry. When you're not frantically trying to orchestrate specific results, you become more aware of the unexpected resources, opportunities, and solutions that appear in your life. You start to see evidence of God's provision and guidance that was always there but was overshadowed by your anxiety. This growing awareness of God's faithfulness creates a positive cycle. As you experience His provision in smaller situations, you become more willing to trust Him with bigger challenges. As you see how He works when you release control, you become more comfortable with uncertainty. As you taste the peace that comes from surrender, you become less willing to return to the exhausting effort of trying to manage outcomes that were never yours to manage. But I want to prepare you for something that might surprise you as you begin implementing these principles. There may be people in your life who are uncomfortable with your newfound peace. They may interpret your reduced anxiety as indifference or irresponsibility. They may try to pull you back into worry by sharing their own fears or criticizing your trust-based approach to challenges. This resistance often comes from people who have built their identity around being responsible worriers, people who believe that their anxiety demonstrates how much they care. When you stop participating in collective worry, it can feel threatening to them because it challenges their belief system about how caring people should respond to uncertainty. Don't let this discourage you from pursuing the peace that God offers. Remember that your peace doesn't diminish your love for others. It actually enhances your ability to love them well. When you're not consumed by anxiety, you can offer them presence, wisdom, and genuine support, instead of joining them in unproductive worry cycles. You may also find that, as you stop trying to control outcomes, some people in your life will need to take more responsibility for their own choices and consequences. This can create temporary discomfort in relationships where others have become accustomed to your anxious involvement in their problems. This shift is actually healthy for everyone involved. When you stop trying to manage other people's lives through worry and control, you create space for them to develop their own relationship with God and their own problem-solving capabilities. You also free yourself to focus on the responsibilities that are actually yours. The key is to make this transition with love and wisdom. You don't need to announce to everyone that you're no longer going to worry about them. You simply begin responding differently when they bring their concerns to you. Instead of joining them in anxiety, you can offer to pray with them, help them identify practical steps they can take, or simply provide a listening ear without taking on the emotional weight of their problems. This change in your response patterns will ultimately benefit everyone in your relationships. People will learn to bring their concerns to God instead of expecting you to carry the weight of their worries. They'll develop more confidence in their ability to handle challenges when they're not receiving anxious advice that implies they can't manage their own lives. Most importantly, they'll see a living example of what it looks like to trust God with uncertain outcomes. Your peace in the midst of challenges will be a powerful testimony to the reality of God's faithfulness and the effectiveness of surrendering control to Him. As we near the end of our time together, I want to leave you with a vision of what your life could look like 6 months from now if you begin implementing these principles consistently. Imagine waking up each morning with anticipation rather than dread. Instead of immediately reviewing everything that could go wrong, you begin each day with gratitude for God's presence and excitement about how He might work through whatever unfolds. Picture yourself making decisions with confidence rather than being paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. You gather available information, seek wise counsel, pray for guidance, and then move forward with peace, knowing that God can use even imperfect decisions for good purposes. Envision your relationships transformed by your newfound emotional freedom. Instead of anxious conversations filled with worry and control, you engage with others from a place of peace and trust. You listen more deeply, love more freely, and offer support without trying to manage outcomes. Imagine facing challenges with resilience rather than being overwhelmed by them. When difficulties arise, you respond with wisdom and appropriate action, but you don't carry the crushing weight of believing that everything depends on you. You do your part and trust God with His part. This transformation is not only possible, it's God's desire for your life. He didn't create you to live in constant anxiety about outcomes you can't control. He designed you to walk in partnership with Him, doing your part with excellence while resting in His sovereignty over all the variables you can't see or influence. The journey from worry to trust isn't always easy, but it's always worthwhile. Every step you take toward releasing control and embracing God's plan brings you closer to the abundant life that Jesus promised. Every moment you choose trust over anxiety is a victory that builds your confidence for the next challenge. Remember that God isn't asking you to trust Him because He needs your confidence to accomplish His purposes. He's inviting you to trust Him because He knows that worry is robbing you of the joy, peace, and effectiveness He wants you to experience. He sees the burden you're carrying, and He's reaching out His hand to take it from you. The question is, are you ready to let go? Are you willing to release your grip on outcomes you were never meant to control? Are you prepared to discover what life looks like when you truly trust that God's plan for you is better than anything you could orchestrate yourself? Your worries have been faithful companions for a long time. They've convinced you that they're protecting you, helping you, keeping you safe. But they've actually been holding you captive, stealing your peace and limiting your ability to experience the fullness of life that God has planned for you. Today can be the day you begin a new chapter. Today can be the day you start learning to live with open hands instead of clenched fists. Today can be the day you discover what Jesus meant when He said, "His yoke is easy and His burden is light." The choice is yours. Will you continue carrying weights that were never meant to be yours, or will you accept God's invitation, to walk in the peace and freedom that come from trusting his perfect plan. The first step in making this transition is learning to recognize the voice of worry versus the voice of wisdom. These two voices can sound remarkably similar, but they produce completely different results in your life. The voice of worry speaks in urgent, frantic tones about disasters that might happen. It uses words like what if, always, and never. It catastrophizes situations and assumes the worst possible outcomes. The voice of wisdom, on the other hand, speaks with calm clarity about actual circumstances that need attention. It uses measured language and focuses on actionable steps rather than imagined disasters. Wisdom acknowledges real challenges without being overwhelmed by them. It considers multiple possibilities without becoming paralyzed by uncertainty. Here's a practical example of how these voices differ. Let's say your teenager is running late, coming home from a friend's house. The voice of worry immediately starts spinning stories. What if they've been in an accident? What if something terrible has happened? I should never have let them go. This always happens when I try to give them freedom. The voice of wisdom responds differently. They're 30 minutes late, which is unusual for them. I'll try calling their phone first. If I can't reach them, I'll contact their friend's parents. If there's still no answer after reasonable attempts, then I'll consider whether further action is needed. Notice the difference. Worry jumps immediately to worst-case scenarios and creates emotional chaos. Wisdom acknowledges the situation calmly and outlines practical steps. Both voices recognize that something needs attention, but only one leads to effective action and maintained peace. Learning to distinguish between these voices is crucial because worry often disguises itself as responsible concern. It convinces you that your anxiety is evidence of how much you care, how responsible you are, or how prepared you want to be. But true responsibility looks very different from worry. True responsibility takes appropriate action based on available information. It prepares for likely scenarios without obsessing over remote possibilities. It considers consequences without being paralyzed by fear of negative outcomes. Most importantly, true responsibility recognizes the limits of what you can actually control or influence. Let me share a story that illustrates this distinction perfectly. Michael was the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been in his family for 3 generations. When the economy started showing signs of instability, Michael found himself consumed with anxiety about the future of the business. He was working 16-hour days, checking financial reports obsessively, and calling emergency meetings to discuss scenarios that might never happen. His wife barely saw him anymore. His children complained that even when he was physically present, his mind was always somewhere else. His health was deteriorating from stress and lack of sleep. Ironically, all this worry was actually making him less effective as a leader, not more prepared for potential challenges. Michael's anxiety was masquerading as responsible leadership, but it was actually preventing him from leading well. His constant focus on potential disasters was creating a culture of fear in his organization. His inability to make decisions confidently was paralyzing the entire company. His exhaustion was affecting his judgment about the very issues he was trying to manage. Then Michael had a conversation with his mentor, a successful businessman who had navigated multiple economic downturns. The mentor asked him a simple but powerful question. Michael, what percentage of the things you're worrying about are actually within your control? This question stopped Michael in his tracks. As he honestly evaluated his concerns, he realized that perhaps 20% of what consumed his mental energy was actually within his direct influence. The other 80% consisted of market conditions, competitor actions, government policies, consumer behavior, and countless other variables that no amount of worry could affect. That night, Michael made 2 lists similar to what we discussed earlier. On the first list, he wrote everything he was anxious about regarding the business. The list filled 2 pages. On the second list, he wrote only the things he could actually control or directly influence. This list was much shorter: product quality, employee development, cost management, customer relationships, and strategic planning. The revelation was profound. Michael realized he had been trying to carry the weight of an entire economy on his shoulders when his actual responsibility was to lead his company well within whatever economic conditions existed. Over the following weeks, Michael restructured his approach entirely. Instead of spending hours analyzing market predictions he couldn't control, he focused on strengthening the areas that were actually within his influence. Instead of calling emergency meetings about remote possibilities, he invested time in developing his team's capabilities and improving operational efficiency. The transformation was remarkable, not just for Michael personally, but for the entire organization. Employees noticed their leader's newfound confidence and calm. Customers responded to the company's renewed focus on service and quality. Even when economic challenges did arise, the company was better positioned to handle them because they had been focusing on fundamentals rather than being paralyzed by fear. Michael's story illustrates a crucial principle. You become more effective at handling actual challenges when you stop exhausting yourself worrying about imaginary ones. When you focus your energy on your real responsibilities, you develop the skills, relationships, and resources needed to navigate whatever circumstances actually arise. This principle applies to every area of life, not just business leadership. Whether you're a parent concerned about your children's future, a student worried about career prospects, or someone facing health challenges, the same dynamic applies. You handle real situations better when you're not depleted by anxiety about situations that exist only in your imagination. But here's where many people get stuck. They understand intellectually that worry is unproductive, but they can't seem to stop doing it. The thoughts keep coming, the anxiety keeps building, and despite their best efforts, they find themselves trapped in familiar patterns of fear and control. If this describes your experience, I want you to know that you're not weak or faithless. Breaking free from chronic worry patterns requires more than just willpower or positive thinking. It requires rewiring deeply ingrained mental habits. And that takes time, patience, and often some specific strategies. One of the most effective approaches is what psychologists call worry windows. Instead of trying to eliminate anxious thoughts entirely, you designate specific times for processing concerns. For example, you might set aside 15 minutes each evening to review any issues that need attention, make plans for addressing them, and then consciously release them until the next scheduled worry session. This approach works because it acknowledges that some degree of concern about important matters is natural and even helpful. But it prevents anxiety from consuming your entire day. When worried thoughts arise outside your designated window, you can acknowledge them briefly and then remind yourself that you'll address them during your scheduled time. During your worry window, apply the principles we've been discussing. Separate your actual responsibilities from God's responsibilities. Identify concrete actions you can take and schedule them appropriately. For concerns that don't require immediate action, consciously hand them over to God and practice releasing your grip on outcomes you can't control. Many people find it helpful to write their worries down during this process. There's something powerful about moving anxious thoughts from your mind onto paper. It often reveals that many concerns are vague and undefined, making them seem more threatening than they actually are. Writing them down forces you to be specific about what you're actually worried about, which often makes the concerns more manageable. You might also discover patterns in your worries that reveal deeper issues. Maybe you notice that most of your anxiety centers around financial security, revealing an underlying belief that your worth depends on material stability. Maybe you realize that your concerns about your children's choices stem from fear that their mistakes reflect your failure as a parent. Identifying these underlying beliefs is crucial because surface-level worry management techniques won't be fully effective until you address the deeper fears and false beliefs that fuel chronic anxiety. This is where understanding your identity in Christ becomes essential. When you truly grasp that your value comes from being God's beloved child, rather than from your performance or circumstances, many worries lose their power over you. When you understand that God's plan for your life is based on His love and wisdom, rather than your ability to control outcomes, you can release your grip on situations that feel overwhelming. This identity shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's one of the most liberating discoveries you can make. You are not primarily a parent who might fail your children, an employee who might lose their job, or a person who might face financial hardship. You are first and foremost a child of God who is deeply loved, completely accepted, and eternally secure in His care. This doesn't mean that your roles and responsibilities don't matter. It means that your peace and worth aren't dependent on how perfectly you fulfill them. You can be an excellent parent while trusting God with your children's ultimate well-being. You can work diligently at your job while finding your security in your relationship with God rather than in your employment status. This perspective transforms how you approach every challenging situation. Instead of feeling like everything depends on you getting it exactly right, you can do your best, while resting in the assurance that God is ultimately responsible for outcomes. Instead of being paralyzed by fear of making mistakes, you can make decisions with confidence, knowing that God can use even imperfect choices for good purposes. Let me tell you about a woman named Linda, who discovered this truth during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Linda was a perfectionist who had built her identity around being the person everyone could count on. She was the daughter who managed her aging parents' care, the mother who orchestrated her children's activities, the employee who never missed deadlines, and the friend who was always available when others needed help. This pattern worked reasonably well until several crises hit simultaneously. Her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Her teenage son was struggling with depression. Her company was going through layoffs. Her marriage was strained by the pressure of managing all these challenges. Linda's response was to work harder, worry more, and try to control every variable in every situation. She researched Alzheimer's care obsessively, scheduled therapy appointments for her son while monitoring his every mood, worked extra hours to prove her value at the company, and tried to manage her husband's stress along with her own. The result was predictable. Linda was heading toward complete burnout. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating regularly, and was becoming increasingly anxious and irritable. Ironically, her desperate attempts to help everyone were actually making most situations worse. Her son felt suffocated by her constant attention. Her husband felt like she was trying to control his responses to their circumstances. Her work performance was declining because she was too distracted and exhausted to focus effectively. The breakthrough came when Linda's pastor helped her see that she had been trying to be the savior in every situation instead of trusting the actual savior to work in each circumstance. She had been acting as if everyone's well-being depended entirely on her efforts, when in reality, God was already at work in each person's life. This realization was both humbling and liberating. Humbling because Linda had to acknowledge that her need to control everything was actually rooted in pride, a belief that she could manage life better than God could. Liberating because it meant she could lay down the crushing weight of responsibility that was never meant to be hers. The changes Linda made weren't dramatic from the outside, but they were revolutionary on the inside. She still helped coordinate her father's care, but she stopped researching every possible treatment and instead focused on ensuring he felt loved and comfortable. She still supported her son's mental health journey, but she stopped trying to manage his emotions and instead created space for him to process his feelings with his therapist and with God. She still worked diligently at her job, but she stopped trying to prove her indispensability and instead focused on contributing her best work within reasonable boundaries. She still cared about her marriage, but she stopped trying to control her husband's stress responses and instead focused on being a supportive, peaceful presence. The results were remarkable. Her father seemed more relaxed when she wasn't constantly anxious about his condition. Her son began opening up more when he felt less pressure to manage her emotions along with his own. Her work relationships improved when she wasn't operating from a place of fear and desperation. Her marriage grew stronger as both partners learned to support each other without trying to fix each other. Most importantly, Linda discovered something she had never experienced before: the peace that comes from knowing that she was loved and valued by God, regardless of how well she managed any particular situation. Her identity was no longer tied to being the perfect daughter, mother, employee, or wife. It was rooted in being God's beloved child. This shift in identity is available to you, regardless of what circumstances you're currently facing. You don't have to earn God's love through perfect worry management or flawless life navigation. You don't have to prove your worthiness by controlling outcomes or preventing every possible negative scenario. God's love for you is not conditional on your performance. His plan for your life is not dependent on your ability to orchestrate specific results. His peace is not reserved for people who have figured out how to never feel anxious. All of these gifts are available to you right now, in whatever condition you find yourself, simply because you are His child. Understanding this truth intellectually is one thing, but experiencing it emotionally and spiritually is another. The transition from head knowledge to heart transformation usually requires practice and often involves some degree of struggle. You might find yourself believing these truths one day and doubting them the next. You might experience profound peace in one situation while being overwhelmed by anxiety in another. This inconsistency doesn't mean you're failing or that these principles don't work. It means you're human, and like all humans, you're learning to walk by faith rather than by sight. Growth in any area of life involves setbacks, breakthroughs, plateaus, and gradual progress. Learning to trust God with your worries follows the same pattern. The key is to be patient with yourself while remaining committed to the process. Each time you successfully release a concern to God, you're building spiritual muscle that makes it easier the next time. Each experience of God's faithfulness in small matters increases your confidence to trust Him with bigger challenges. Think of it like learning to play a musical instrument. At first, every note requires conscious effort and concentration. Your fingers don't want to cooperate, the timing feels awkward, and the results are often more noise than music. But with consistent practice, muscle memory develops. Eventually, you can play complex pieces without having to think consciously about every movement. Learning to trust God with your worries follows a similar progression. Initially, every anxious thought requires deliberate effort to recognize and release. The process feels unfamiliar and sometimes forced, but as you practice consistently, trusting becomes more natural and automatic. Eventually, you find yourself releasing concerns to God almost instinctively when they arise. The difference is that unlike learning an instrument, where the benefits are primarily personal and recreational, learning to trust God with your worries transforms every aspect of your life. Your relationships improve because you're not trying to control other people's choices. Your decision-making becomes clearer because you're not paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. Your health benefits because you're not carrying the physical stress of chronic anxiety. Most importantly, your relationship with God deepens as you experience His faithfulness firsthand. Each time you release control and watch Him work in situations you couldn't have managed yourself, your confidence in His character grows. Each experience of peace in the midst of uncertainty strengthens your foundation for the next challenge. This growing relationship with God becomes the source of unshakable peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. You begin to understand what the Apostle Paul meant when he wrote about being content in every situation, not because every situation is pleasant, but because every situation is an opportunity to experience God's presence and faithfulness. As we continue this journey together, I want you to consider what might be possible in your life if you were no longer held captive by worry about outcomes you can't control. What dreams have you put on hold because you were too anxious about potential failure? What relationships have been strained by your need to manage other people's choices? What opportunities have you missed because you were paralyzed by fear of making the wrong decision? The abundant life that Jesus promised isn't just about eternal destinies. It's about experiencing freedom, joy, and purpose right now in the midst of whatever circumstances you're facing. This life is available to you, not someday when you've learned to never worry, but today as you begin taking steps to release your grip on things that were never meant to be yours to control. Your worries have been convincing you that they're necessary, that they're helping you stay safe and prepared. But what if the opposite is true? What if your chronic anxiety is actually the thing that's been limiting your ability to experience the fullness of life that God has planned for you? Today can be the beginning of discovering what life looks like when you truly trust that God's plan for you is better than anything you could orchestrate yourself. Today can be the start of learning to live with open hands and a peaceful heart, regardless of how uncertain your circumstances might seem. The question that remains is simple but profound. Are you ready to find out what God can do with your life when you stop trying to do His job and start trusting Him to do it perfectly? The answer to that question will determine whether you continue living under the weight of burdens that were never meant to be yours, or whether you step into the freedom that comes from understanding your true role in God's story. And I need to tell you something that might surprise you. God isn't waiting for you to become perfect at trusting Him before He starts blessing your willingness to try. Right now, in this very moment, as you're listening to these words, God sees your heart. He sees the fears you carry, the sleepless nights you've endured, the weight you've been shouldering alone, and His response isn't disappointment in your struggle with worry. His response is compassion for His child who has been trying so hard to carry things that He never asked you to carry. This is where many people misunderstand what it means to give their worries to Jesus. They think it's about achieving some perfect state of never feeling anxious again. They imagine it requires a level of spiritual maturity they haven't reached yet. They believe they need to have stronger faith before they're qualified to experience God's peace. But that's like saying you need to be completely healthy before you can go to a doctor. The whole point of coming to Jesus with your worries is that you can't handle them yourself. He's not looking for people who have it all figured out. He's looking for people who are tired of trying to figure it all out alone. Let me tell you about a conversation I had just last week with a man named James. He'd been attending our church for months, sitting in the back row, leaving immediately after the service ended. Finally, he approached me after a particularly difficult message about surrender and trust. "Pastor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to believe what you're teaching, but I don't think I have enough faith. I've been trying to give my worries to God for years, but they keep coming back. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this kind of peace." James went on to explain that he'd been carrying the weight of his family's financial struggles for over 2 years. His small business had been devastated by economic changes beyond his control. He'd burned through their savings, borrowed money from relatives, and was now facing the possibility of losing their home. Every night, he lay awake, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up to a solution. "I pray about it every morning," he told me, "but by lunchtime I'm right back to worrying. I feel like I'm failing God and my family at the same time." Here's what I shared with James, and what I want to share with you. Giving your worries to God isn't a one-time transaction that makes them disappear forever. It's a daily, sometimes hourly practice of releasing control and choosing trust. The fact that you have to do it repeatedly doesn't mean in a world that constantly you're failing. It means you're human. Living presents new reasons to worry. Think about it this way. You don't eat one meal and then never need food again. You don't take one breath and then never need oxygen again. Physical life requires ongoing nourishment and sustained effort. Spiritual peace works the same way. You release your worries to God, experience His peace, and then life presents new challenges that require you to practice surrender again. The goal isn't to reach a point where you never feel the temptation to worry. The goal is to develop such a strong habit of releasing control to God that worry doesn't dominate your thoughts and emotions when it does arise. It's the difference between being controlled by anxiety and being able to acknowledge anxious thoughts without being ruled by them. James needed to understand that his struggle with worry didn't disqualify him from experiencing God's peace. Actually, his awareness of his need for help was exactly what qualified him to receive it. Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who recognize their spiritual poverty, not to those who think they've achieved spiritual wealth. Over the following months, James began practicing what I call micro-surrenders throughout each day. Instead of trying to give all his financial concerns to God in one grand gesture of faith, he started releasing specific worries as they arose. When his mind began calculating worst-case scenarios during his morning coffee, he would consciously hand that particular fear to God. When anxiety about next month's mortgage payment hit during his lunch break, he would pause and practice releasing that specific concern. The transformation wasn't dramatic at first, but it was steady and sustainable. James discovered that he could function much more effectively when he wasn't carrying the emotional weight of trying to guarantee specific financial outcomes. His creativity returned, helping him identify new business opportunities he'd been too anxious to notice before. His relationship with his wife improved because he stopped bringing his financial stress into every conversation. Most importantly, James found that his faith was actually growing stronger through this process of repeated surrender, not weaker. Each time he released control and watched God provide in unexpected ways, his confidence in God's faithfulness increased. Each experience of peace in the midst of uncertainty built his spiritual muscle for the next challenge. This is how trust develops in any relationship. You don't immediately trust a new friend with your deepest secrets. You start by sharing smaller things and observing how they respond. As they prove trustworthy in small matters, you become willing to trust them with bigger concerns. Your relationship with God follows the same pattern. Maybe you start by giving Him your anxiety about a difficult conversation you need to have. When you experience His peace and wisdom in handling that situation, you become more willing to trust Him with your concerns about your child's struggles. As you see His faithfulness in that area, you find the courage to release your grip on even bigger worries like your health or your future security. Each step builds on the previous one, creating a foundation of experienced faithfulness that makes the next level of trust feel less risky and more natural. This is why the Bible talks about growing from faith to faith and from glory to glory. Spiritual maturity isn't about achieving perfection. It's about progressive transformation through repeated experiences of God's goodness. But here's something crucial that James learned, and that I want you to understand. God's faithfulness in your life doesn't always look like getting the outcomes you originally hoped for. Sometimes His goodness is revealed through providing exactly what you asked for. Sometimes it's revealed through giving you something better than what you asked for. And sometimes it's revealed through giving you the strength and grace to walk through difficult circumstances with peace and purpose. In James's case, God's provision came through a combination of all three. Some months brought unexpected income that covered their immediate needs. Other months brought opportunities James never would have considered, before his financial crisis forced him to think creatively. And throughout the entire process, God provided the emotional and spiritual strength for James and his family to walk through uncertainty without being destroyed by it. The house they were afraid of losing, they kept it. But more importantly, they learned that their security didn't depend on keeping it. The business that was struggling, it eventually stabilized and grew, but James discovered that his identity wasn't tied to being a successful entrepreneur. The marriage that was strained by financial pressure, it became stronger as both partners learned to find their peace in God rather than in their circumstances. This is what happens when you truly learn to give your worries to Jesus. The external circumstances may or may not change according to your preferences, but your internal experience is transformed regardless. You discover that your well-being doesn't depend on controlling outcomes. Your peace doesn't require having all the answers. Your security isn't based on your ability to prevent problems from arising. Instead, you find an unshakable foundation in God's character, His promises, and His demonstrated faithfulness in your life. This foundation remains solid, whether you're facing challenges or enjoying seasons of ease, whether your prayers are answered the way you hoped or in ways you never expected. Now I want to address something that might be creating resistance in your heart as you consider making this journey from worry to trust. You might be thinking about specific people in your life whose well-being feels entirely dependent on your constant concern and vigilance. Maybe it's an aging parent whose health is declining. Maybe it's a child who's making dangerous choices. Maybe it's a spouse who's struggling with addiction or depression. The thought of releasing your grip on their welfare might feel not just scary, but actually irresponsible. How can you stop worrying about people you love without becoming indifferent to their needs? How can you trust God with their lives when you can see so clearly what they need and what dangers they're facing? This is one of the most challenging aspects of learning to live without chronic worry, and I want to address it honestly. Releasing control doesn't mean becoming emotionally detached from people you love. It doesn't mean stopping your efforts to help them or support them. It doesn't mean pretending that their struggles don't affect you. What it does mean is recognizing that your worry about them is not actually protecting them or helping them. In fact, your anxiety often creates additional stress in their lives and can interfere with their ability to develop their own relationship with God and their own problem-solving capabilities. Consider the example of a mother whose adult son is struggling with substance abuse. Her natural instinct is to worry constantly about his safety, to try to control his environment, to prevent access to drugs, to monitor his activities, and to feel responsible for his choices. This worry feels like love, but it often produces outcomes that are the opposite of loving. The son may feel suffocated by his mother's anxiety and pull away from the relationship. He may become dependent on her worry as a substitute for taking responsibility for his own recovery. He may never develop the internal motivation to change because he's always focused on managing his mother's emotions rather than dealing with his own issues. When the mother learns to release her son to God's care, several things can happen. First, she becomes emotionally available to offer genuine support rather than anxious control. Second, her son is forced to face the consequences of his choices without the buffer of his mother's worry. Third, both mother and son can develop their own relationships with God rather than being enmeshed in each other's emotional states. This doesn't guarantee that the son will immediately overcome his addiction. It does mean that both mother and son are positioned for the kind of growth and healing that can only happen when people stop trying to manage each other's lives and start trusting God with outcomes they can't control. The same principle applies to every relationship where you've been carrying the weight of worry about someone else's choices or circumstances. Your concern for them is natural and good. Your willingness to help and support them is admirable, but your anxiety about their situation is not contributing to their well-being. In most cases, it's actually hindering both their growth and your ability to love them effectively. Learning to love without worry is one of the most profound gifts you can give to the people in your life. It communicates that you believe in their ability to handle challenges with God's help. It creates space for them to develop resilience and faith. It models what it looks like to find security in God, rather than in controlling circumstances. But this kind of love requires tremendous courage, because it means accepting that you cannot guarantee the safety or happiness of the people you care about most. You can influence, support, and encourage them, but you cannot control their choices or prevent all suffering from touching their lives. This acceptance isn't passive resignation, it's active trust in God's love for them, which is even greater than your own. It's confidence that He is working in their lives in ways you cannot see, through circumstances you might not choose, for purposes that serve their ultimate good, even when immediate results are painful or disappointing. Think about how God loves you. Does He prevent every difficulty from touching your life? Does He override your free will to ensure you never make mistakes? Does He worry about your choices in the way that human parents worry about their children's decisions? Of course not. God's love for you is expressed through His constant presence, His provision of wisdom and strength for whatever you face, His forgiveness when you make mistakes, and His ability to bring good out of even your worst decisions. He loves you enough to allow you to experience the consequences of your choices, because that's often how real growth and maturity develop. This is the kind of love He's calling you to extend to others. Love that supports without controlling, love that believes the best while acknowledging reality, love that offers help without taking responsibility for outcomes, love that trusts God's work in other people's lives, even when that work involves struggle and difficulty. Practicing this kind of love requires daily surrender of your need to protect and control the people you care about. It means releasing them into God's hands repeatedly, especially when they're facing challenges that frighten you. It means praying for their welfare while accepting that God's definition of their welfare might be different from yours. But here's what's remarkable about this kind of love. It actually draws people closer to you rather than pushing them away. When people feel that you love them without trying to manage them, they're more likely to seek your counsel and support. When they know that you're not anxiously monitoring their every choice, they're more willing to be honest about their struggles. Most importantly, when people see you modeling trust in God's goodness and sovereignty, they're more likely to develop their own relationship with Him. Your peace in the midst of their struggles becomes a testimony to God's faithfulness that words alone could never communicate. This transformation in how you love others is one of the most beautiful fruits of learning to give your worries to Jesus. As you experience the freedom that comes from releasing control in your own life, you naturally begin extending that same freedom to others. As you discover the peace that comes from trusting God with your circumstances, you become able to trust Him with the circumstances of people you love. The ripple effects of this change extend far beyond your immediate family and close friends. When you stop trying to control outcomes through worry and manipulation, you become a safe person for others to be around. People are drawn to individuals who radiate peace rather than anxiety, who offer support without strings attached, who listen without immediately trying to fix everything. You become someone who can sit with others in their pain without needing to eliminate it immediately. You can celebrate others' successes without feeling threatened by them. You can offer wisdom without insisting that others follow your advice. You can love others without needing them to meet your emotional needs or validate your worth. This kind of emotional and spiritual maturity doesn't develop overnight, but it's one of the most attractive qualities a person can possess. It draws people like a magnet because everyone is hungry for relationships with individuals who have found their security in something deeper than circumstances, more reliable than human approval, and more lasting than temporary successes. As we begin to bring our time together to a close, I want to leave you with a practical challenge that can help you take the first concrete steps toward the freedom we've been discussing. For the next 7 days, I want you to practice what I call the surrender experiment. Here's how it works. Each morning when you wake up, before you check your phone or start reviewing your mental to-do list, spend 5 minutes in conscious surrender. Identify the 3 biggest worries that are currently consuming your mental energy. Write them down if it helps. Then, one by one, speak them out loud to God and consciously release them into His hands. Use whatever words feel natural to you. God, I might say something like, been carrying the weight of my job situation, and I'm giving it to you today. I trust that you're working even when I can't see how. Or, Lord, I've been anxious about my child's struggles, and I'm choosing to believe that you love them even more than I do, and that you're at work in their life. The key is to make this surrender specific and intentional. Don't just pray, help me not to worry. Actually name the concerns you're releasing and consciously choose to trust God with them. Then, throughout the day, when you notice your mind returning to these worries, gently remind yourself that you've already given them to God and redirect your attention to whatever task or person is right in front of you. At the end of each day, spend a few minutes reflecting on what you noticed. Did you feel lighter after the morning surrender? Were you able to be more present in conversations and activities? Did you find yourself handling challenges with more peace and clarity? Did you notice God's faithfulness in small ways throughout the day? Don't expect perfection during this experiment. You'll probably find yourself picking up the worries you surrendered multiple times throughout each day. That's normal and expected. Simply notice when it happens. Remind yourself that you've already given these concerns to God and practice releasing them again. The goal isn't to achieve a worry-free week. The goal is to begin developing new mental habits and to start experiencing, even in small doses, what it feels like to live without carrying the weight of things you were never meant to control. Some people find it helpful to choose a physical symbol during this experiment, perhaps a small stone they carry in their pocket. Every time they touch the stone, they're reminded to release their current worries to God. Others prefer to set gentle reminders on their phone that prompt them to practice surrender throughout the day. The specific method matters less than the consistency. What's important is that you begin training your mind to default toward trust rather than worry, toward surrender rather than control, toward faith rather than fear. By the end of 7 days, you'll have a much clearer sense of whether this approach resonates with your heart and produces positive changes in your daily experience. More importantly, you'll have taken concrete steps toward the kind of life Jesus described when He said His yoke is easy and His burden is light. Remember, this isn't about achieving perfect trust or never feeling anxious again. It's about discovering what becomes possible in your life when you stop trying to be God and start trusting the actual God to handle the things that are beyond your control. Your worries have been faithful companions, but they've been terrible masters. They've convinced you that they're necessary for survival, but they've actually been limiting your ability to thrive. They've promised to keep you safe, but they've been keeping you imprisoned. Today, Jesus is extending the same invitation to you that He offered to His first disciples. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The rest He's offering isn't just physical relaxation. It's the deep soul rest that comes from knowing that you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, because the one who actually does carry the world has already taken that burden from you. The question that remains is simple. Will you accept His invitation? Will you begin the journey from worry to trust, from control to surrender, from carrying burdens alone, to walking in partnership with the God who loves you more than you can imagine? Your life is waiting on the other side of that decision. The abundant, peaceful, joy-filled life that Jesus promised is available to you not someday in the future, but right now, as you take the first step toward releasing your grip on things that were never meant to be yours to hold. What will it be? Will you continue carrying the weight that's been crushing your spirit, or will you discover what it means to truly rest in the arms of the one who has been waiting patiently to carry it for you? The choice is before you right now, and I want to be completely honest about what happens next. Making the decision to trust God with your worries isn't like flipping a switch that instantly transforms your entire emotional landscape. It's more like planting a seed that requires daily watering, consistent sunlight, and patient nurturing before you see the full harvest of peace that God intends for your life. In the first few days after you make this commitment, you might feel a sense of relief, almost like you've been holding your breath for months and can finally exhale. But then, as new challenges arise or old patterns reassert themselves, you might wonder if you've made any real progress at all. You might find yourself thinking, I gave this worry to God yesterday, so why am I feeling anxious about it again today? Let me tell you something that might surprise you. This back and forth between surrender and struggle isn't a sign that you're failing. It's actually a sign that you're growing. Every time you recognize that you've picked up a burden you've already given to God and then consciously choose to release it again, you're strengthening spiritual muscles that will serve you for the rest of your life. Think about it like learning to drive a car. At first, every action requires conscious thought and deliberate effort. You have to remind yourself to check your mirrors, signal before turning, maintain proper following distance. It feels awkward and overwhelming because you're trying to manage so many different elements simultaneously, but gradually, these actions become automatic. You don't have to consciously remember to brake when approaching a red light or steer around curves in the road. The skills that once required intense concentration become natural responses that happen without effort. Learning to live without chronic worry follows the same progression. Initially, every anxious thought requires deliberate intervention. You have to consciously recognize the worry, remember to release it to God, and redirect your attention to something constructive. It feels unnatural because you're breaking patterns that have been ingrained for years or even decades. But as you practice consistently, something remarkable begins to happen. You start catching yourself in worry spirals earlier and earlier. Instead of spending hours consumed by anxiety before recognizing what's happening, you notice the signs within minutes or even seconds. The time between recognizing worry and releasing it becomes shorter and shorter. Eventually, you reach a point where trust becomes your default response to uncertainty rather than anxiety. This doesn't mean you never feel concerned about challenging situations. It means that concern doesn't escalate into panic because you've developed an automatic habit of placing difficult circumstances in God's capable hands. But here's something crucial that I need to share with you about this journey. God isn't waiting for you to master the art of worry-free living before He starts blessing your efforts to trust Him. His grace meets you exactly where you are right now, in the middle of your struggles with anxiety, in the midst of your imperfect attempts to surrender control. Every time you make the choice to release a worry to God, even if you have to make that same choice again an hour later, heaven celebrates that decision. Every moment you choose trust over fear, surrender over control, faith over anxiety, you're participating in the kind of relationship with God that He's been longing to have with you since the day you were born. You see, God's heart toward you isn't like a demanding boss who's frustrated with your slow progress or disappointed in your imperfect performance. His heart is like a loving parent who celebrates every small step their child takes toward maturity, who remains patient through setbacks and mistakes, who sees potential and growth even when the child can only see their failures. This understanding changes everything about how you approach the process of learning to trust God with your worries. Instead of putting pressure on yourself to achieve immediate and permanent victory over anxiety, you can approach each day as a new opportunity to practice surrender, knowing that God is pleased with your willingness to keep trying rather than frustrated with your need to keep learning. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. There was a woman named Catherine who came to see me several months ago. She'd been struggling with anxiety about her daughter's upcoming wedding for almost a year. What should have been a joyful celebration had become a source of constant stress as Catherine worried about every detail, from the weather forecast to the guest list to the possibility that something would go wrong and ruin her daughter's special day. Catherine had heard me teach about giving worries to God, and she'd been trying to apply these principles for weeks with limited success. "Pastor," she said during our first conversation, "I pray about the wedding every morning and ask God to handle all the details, but by noon I'm right back to making lists and calling vendors and losing sleep over things I can't control. I feel like I'm letting God down by not being able to trust Him better." Here's what I shared. Wasn't disappointed in her struggles with surrendered with Catherine, and what I want you to understand. Go. He was delighted that she kept coming back to him every time she noticed herself falling into old patterns of worry and control. Each time she recognized her anxiety and chose to release it again, she was demonstrating faith, not failure. The breakthrough for Catherine came when she stopped focusing on her inability to trust perfectly and started celebrating her will, discouraged by the fact that she had to surrenderingness to trust repeatedly. Instead of being the same concerns multiple times each day, she began thanking God for His patience with her learning process and for His faithfulness despite her imperfect faith. This shift in perspective transformed everything. Catherine's morning surrender times became less about achieving worry-free perfection and more about connecting with a God who loved her enough to keep receiving her anxieties, no matter how many times she brought them to him. Her daily battles with control became opportunities to experience grace rather than evidence of spiritual inadequacy. The wedding, incidentally, was beautiful. There were a few minor glitches that Catherine's old self would have seen as disasters, but her new perspective allowed her to see them as part of the unique story of her daughter's special day. More importantly, Catherine was able to be fully present for the celebration instead of being consumed by anxiety about things that might go wrong. But here's the key insight from Catherine's experience. Her peace wasn't dependent on the wedding going perfectly. She had already found peace in the process of learning to trust God with outcomes she couldn't control. The successful wedding was a bonus, but it wasn't necessary for her emotional well-being. This is what I want you to understand as you begin your own journey toward freedom from chronic worry. Your peace doesn't have to wait until your circumstances align perfectly with your preferences. Your joy doesn't depend on your ability to prevent all potential problems from arising. Your security isn't based on your skill at managing outcomes. All of these gifts are available to you right now, in whatever situation you're currently facing, through the simple but profound act of releasing control to the God who has been managing the entire universe long before you were born and will continue managing it long after you've gone home to be with him. But I want to address something that might be creating resistance in your heart right now. You might be thinking, this sounds wonderful, but you don't know my specific situation. My problems are different. My responsibilities are more complex. My circumstances are more urgent than the examples you've been sharing. I understand this concern because I hear it from almost everyone who's learning to apply these principles. There's something about our own worries that makes them seem more legitimate, more pressing, more deserving of anxious attention than anyone else's concerns. But here's what I've learned after years of walking with people through every imaginable crisis. The principles of trust and surrender work in every situation, not because the situations are similar, but because God's character remains constant, regardless of what circumstances you're facing. The truth is, friend, God isn't asking you to figure this out perfectly before you take the first step. He's simply asking you to begin. Right now, in this very moment, you can make the choice that changes everything. You can decide that today is the day you stop carrying burdens that were never meant to be yours. Today is the day you discover what it means to truly rest in the arms of the one who has been waiting patiently to carry them for you. Your worries have whispered lies about your future, but God's voice speaks truth over your destiny. The question isn't whether you're strong enough to trust him perfectly. The question is whether you're tired enough of worry to let him be God in your life. Take his hand, release your grip, and step into the peace that's been waiting for you all along.